Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are opening up a file that, honestly, I was a little hesitant to touch at first.
Yeah, it's definitely a massive departure for us.
It really is. I mean,
Yeah.
usually you and I are looking at tech trends or modern psychology or maybe unpacking a biography of a CEO. But this is a cold case file from the first century.
Right. And it is arguably the most famous, controversial, and heavily scrutinized death investigation in human history.
Exactly. And, when you really look at the source material we have today, it actually fits our format perfectly.
It does, because we aren't doing a theology lesson here. We aren't analyzing metaphors or poetic language. We are looking at a literal forensic investigation of events that took place roughly 2,000 years ago in Jerusalem.
And that is exactly the hook for me. The premise here isn't believe this because the book says so.
Right.
The premise for you, the listener, is this. Can we use modern medical knowledge, strict legal standards of evidence, and rigorous historical analysis to determine what actually happened to Jesus of Nazareth?
Exactly. And the question on the table is simple, even though the implications are obviously huge. If you strip away the stained glass windows, the choir music, and all the religious assumptions, what does the hard data actually say?
To get to that data, we are relying on a stack of interviews conducted by Lee Strobel. And for those of you who don't know the name, Strobel was a legal editor for the Chicago Tribune.
Yeah, he wasn't a pastor or a theologian. He was a hard-nosed, skeptical journalist.
Right. He approached this entire topic the exact same way he'd approach a mob hit or a corporate corruption scandal.
He took a very adversarial approach. He didn't just go interview a bunch of priests. He grilled experts in forensic pathology, ancient history, philosophy. He talked to people with PhDs who deal exclusively in facts.
So the mission for this deep dive is pretty specific. We are going to unpack the gritty details.
Yeah.
And fair warning to you listening, some of this gets pretty graphic because we are talking about Roman execution methods.
Yeah, it's not light material.
No, it's not. But we're trying to answer two fundamental questions. One, did Jesus actually die on the cross? And two, is there any credible evidence, like admissible in a court of law evidence, that he actually returned?
That's the roadmap. Because in history, just like in science, we are always looking for cause and effect. If we have a massive effect like the sudden rise of a worldwide movement based on a resurrection in the very city where the execution happened.
You need a cause sufficient to explain it.
Exactly. So let's look at the facts.
All right, let's start with part one, the death. Now, I've heard this theory floating around for years. It pops up in spy novels and internet conspiracy forums. It's called the Swoon Theory.
Oh, right. The idea that he didn't actually die.
Exactly. The theory is that he was maybe drugged or he just fainted from exhaustion on the cross, and the Romans, being busy or maybe just lazy, took him down thinking he was dead.
And then the cool air of the tomb revived him.
Right. He wakes up, rolls the stone away, and everyone just thought it was a miracle. I mean, on the surface, it sounds more plausible than an actual resurrection.
Right. Well, it appeals to the modern mind because it's naturalistic. It feels cleaner. But Strobel took that specific theory to Dr. Alexander Metherell. He's a medical doctor, a researcher, a pathologist. And to put it mildly, Dr. Metherell completely dismantled the swoon theory piece by piece.
How so?
He argues that if you look at the medical pathology of what happened before the cross, the idea of a swoon is just medically impossible.
Before the cross? You mean the flogging?
Actually, even before that. Metherell starts the clock in the Garden of Gethsemane the night before. The historical accounts say he was in such intense psychological agony that he was sweating blood.
Now, skeptics usually roll their eyes at that and say, well, that's clearly poetry. It's a metaphor.
Like saying, I was sweating bullets.
Exactly.
But Dr. Metherell points out that this is actually a documented medical condition called hematidrosis. It is rare, but it happens. When the body is under extreme anxiety or stress, the chemicals can literally break down the capillaries in the sweat glands. You bleed into your sweat.
So the source material claims this is a biological reaction, not just a dramatic story.
Yes, and the medical implication is what really matters for the investigation. This condition leaves the skin extremely fragile and sensitive. It's incredibly tender. So when the Roman soldiers took him for the flogging the next morning, his skin was already primed for maximum damage.
And we definitely need to talk about the flogging, because I think in movies we see a guy with a standard whip and it looks painful, but it doesn't really look lethal.
Yeah, the movies usually tone it down significantly. The Romans used a specific weapon called a flagrum. It was a whip with braided leather thongs. But woven into the leather were heavy metal balls and sharp pieces of sheep bone.
Oh, well, that sounds mechanical. Like it was designed for shredding, not just hurting.
It was literally an instrument of tissue removal. The metal balls would cause deep contusions and deep bruising, and the bone would cut into the flesh. Metherell describes the back being essentially shredded, often exposing the spine and the deep muscles.
That's horrifying.
It wasn't just immense pain. From a strict medical standpoint, this leads to something called hypovolemic shock.
Okay, let's unpack that term for a second. What exactly is hypovolemic shock?
Hypo means low, vol refers to volume, and emic is blood. So it's a severe state of shock caused by a critical loss of blood volume. The heart starts racing to pump blood that just isn't there, blood pressure drops, and the kidneys shut down to preserve fluid.
So by the time he carried his cross, he was already in critical condition.
Absolutely. He would have been staggering, fainting, which actually matches the historical account of Simon of Cyrene being forced to carry the cross for him.
So he's already half dead before the nails even go in. But let's talk about the mechanics of the cross itself. I think most of us have this idea that crucifixion kills you through the pain or maybe bleeding out. But the source material says it's actually something else.
Correct. And this is the terrifying genius of the Roman design. Crucifixion is essentially death by slow asphyxiation.
Suffocation.
Yes. When you are hanging there by your arms, the weight of the body pulls down on the diaphragm. It puts the chest in a permanent inhaled position. You can breathe air in, but you literally cannot breathe it out.
You're stuck holding your breath.
Unless you push up. To exhale, just to let the carbon dioxide out, the victim has to push up against the nails driven through their feet.
But the feet are nailed to the wood.
Exactly. So to take a single breath, you have to bear down on a heavy nail driven through the metatarsal bones, which Metherell notes would be crushing the nerves.
Unbelievable.
Then you exhale, your muscles give out, and you sink back down to hang by your wrists, which is also crushing the median nerve in the arms. Metherell compares the pain to taking a pair of pliers and crushing your funny bone, but continuous and unbearable.
So you have to inflict that torture on yourself just to get oxygen.
Over and over again. Eventually, complete exhaustion sets in. You just can't push up anymore. Carbon dioxide builds up in the blood, leading to respiratory acidosis, and eventually cardiac arrest. It is a slow, agonizing suffocation.
Okay, that is remarkably grim. But let me play the defense attorney for a second. Is there any chance he could have faked his death? Maybe he held his breath. Could the Roman soldiers have been tricked?
The sources are very firm on this. The Romans were professional killers. This wasn't a hobby for them. If a prisoner escaped a death sentence, the soldier responsible was executed himself. They had a massive incentive to make sure the job was done.
Makes sense.
But there is a specific medical detail in the text that acts like an ancient coroner's report.
You're talking about the spear thrust.
Yes. The biblical account mentions a soldier thrust a spear into his side to confirm death, and blood and water flowed out. Now, to an ancient observer, that sounds mysterious, maybe symbolic. But to a modern pathologist like Metherell, it's a clear medical diagnosis.
What does it mean?
The water was likely fluid from around the heart and lungs, known as pericardial and pleural effusion. This is caused by the hypovolemic shock and heart failure we just talked about.
So the fact that they recorded water coming out, something they wouldn't have understood medically back then, actually adds credibility to the account.
Precisely. It's an unintended confirmation. Metherell's ultimate conclusion is that it is medically impossible to survive that combination of trauma. Even if, hypothetically, he was taken down alive, he would be a broken, bleeding wreck, not someone who could inspire a movement claiming he was the Lord of Life. He would need a trauma center, not a tomb.
Okay, so the Swoon Theory is out. The medical evidence says he was unquestionably dead. That brings us to part 2, the empty tomb. Because if he was dead, the body had to go somewhere.
This is where we shift from forensic pathology to legal and historical analysis. We turn to the interview with Dr. William Lane Craig. And the first thing we have to establish is that there was a proper burial to begin with.
Right, because if the Romans just threw him in a common ditch, which they often did with criminals, then the whole empty tomb story is just a legend.
Exactly. But Dr. Craig points to something called the 1 Corinthians 15 Creed. This isn't just a regular Bible verse. It's an early creed, a summary of beliefs that scholars date to within just 2 to 8 years of the actual event.
Wait, 2 to 8 years? That is incredibly early for ancient history.
Yeah.
I mean, usually legends about figures like Alexander the Great took hundreds of years to develop.
Right. This is practically a newsflash in historical terms. It states clearly that Jesus was buried and raised, but the strongest historical argument for the burial is actually a specific person, Joseph of Arimathea.
The guy who supposedly buried him.
Yes, but look at who he was. The texts say he was a member of the Sanhedrin, the Jewish High Council, the very same council that voted to kill Jesus.
So he's technically one of the bad guys in the narrative.
Think about the logic there. If you are a Christian inventing a legend 50 years later and you need someone to give your leader an honorable burial, would you make the hero of the story a member of the exact group you hated?
No way. You'd make it Peter or John or some secret loyal supporter. You wouldn't give credit to the bad guys. It'd be like writing a story about World War II and making a Nazi general the hero who saves the protagonist.
Exactly. It doesn't make any sense unless it actually happened that way. The fact that Joseph of Arimathea is explicitly named makes it historically probable. The early Christians wouldn't invent a specific prominent member of the Sanhedrin if people could just go check the public records. It strongly suggests the burial account is accurate.
Okay, so he's in the tomb. Now we get to the discovery. And this is where the sources highlight a massive aha moment for me regarding the witnesses.
You mean the women discovering the tomb?
Yes, the accounts say women, Mary Magdalene and others, were the ones who found the tomb empty. Now, to you listening today, that sounds perfectly normal. So what? But you really have to contextualize this historically.
You certainly do. In first-century Jewish culture, a woman's testimony was considered virtually worthless. They couldn't even testify in a court of law. So you have to apply the legal criterion of embarrassment.
Meaning you don't invent details that make you look bad.
Right. If you are inventing a legend to convince people that Jesus is alive, you absolutely do not use women as your primary witnesses. It would severely hurt your case in that culture.
You would say Peter found the tomb, or John, or any prominent man.
Precisely. The only logical reason the gospel writers would say women found the tomb is because women actually found the tomb. They were stuck with the facts. Even though those facts were culturally embarrassing or unhelpful for their argument, it just rings true historically.
And there's one more point Dr. Craig makes about the empty tomb that I found fascinating. It's what he calls the enemy's admission.
This is a crucial piece of circumstantial evidence. When the disciples started preaching that Jesus was alive, the Jewish authorities, who desperately wanted to crush this new movement, didn't say, "No, he's not. His body is right there in the tomb."
Right. They could have just rolled back the stone, produced the dead body, and the game is over. Christianity ends right there on day one.
But instead, they claimed that the disciples stole the body in the night. Do you see what that implies?
It implies the body was actually gone.
Exactly. The enemies admitted the tomb was vacant. They were just trying to explain how it got empty. But everyone, friend and foe alike, agreed that it was empty.
So we have a medically confirmed dead body, and we have a confirmed missing body. That leaves us with the biggest question of all. The appearances. Did anyone actually see him? Because if the tomb is empty, maybe someone just moved him. That doesn't mean he's alive.
And that brings us to the interview with Dr. Gary Habermas. He focuses heavily on the eyewitness accounts, and the scale of these sightings is really significant. We aren't talking about one person in a dark room having a vision.
Right. The list includes Mary Magdalene, the other women, the core disciples, 2 guys walking on the road to Emmaus, and the 500 brethren mentioned in that early creed we talked about.
Yeah.
That is a lot of people.
It is. But the skeptic will naturally say, well, hallucinations. Maybe they were so grief-stricken they just imagined it. We see what we want to see, right?
That's the hallucination theory. And it sounds plausible on the surface.
Until you consult a clinical psychologist, which Strobel did. He spoke with Gary Collins. The expert rebuttal here is that hallucinations are strictly individual occurrences. They happen in one person's brain. It's exactly like a dream. You and I cannot share the same dream at the exact same time.
So if 500 people claim to see the same thing at the same time?
That's not a hallucination. That's a physical event. The sources point out that these appearances happen to different people at different times, indoors, outdoors, to friends, and crucially, to enemies.
That's the part that sticks with me the most. It's one thing for Peter to see Jesus. He loved him. He wanted to see him. But what about the skeptics?
This is one of the strongest historical arguments. Dr. Habermas highlights 2 key conversions, James and Saul. James was Jesus' own brother. The historical texts tell us that during Jesus' life, his family thought he was completely crazy. James didn't believe in him at all.
I mean, imagine your brother claiming to be God. You'd be the absolute last person to believe it.
Exactly. But then history tells us James becomes a primary leader in the early church in Jerusalem and is eventually stoned to death for his unwavering belief that his brother is the Messiah. What changed his mind? The early creed explicitly says he appeared to James.
And then there is Saul of Tarsus, who later becomes the Apostle Paul.
Saul wasn't just a mild skeptic. He was a hostile, violent persecutor. He was actively arresting and killing Christians. He deeply hated this movement. Then, suddenly, he does a complete 180-degree turn. He becomes the greatest missionary for the exact faith he tried to destroy. He willingly suffers beatings, shipwreck, and eventual execution in Rome.
And his explanation for this change is the same. He claims he saw the risen Jesus.
Right. Dr. Habermas argues that you need a cause sufficient to explain that massive psychological effect. People don't just radicalize against their own best interests, giving up power and status without a compelling reason. A shared hallucination simply doesn't fit the facts of these radical reversals.
Which leads us perfectly into the final category of evidence, the circumstantial evidence. We've looked at the medical data, the empty tomb, and the eyewitness accounts. But now we're looking at what J.P. Moreland calls the social earthquake.
This is the so what of the investigation. We are looking at the cultural aftermath. Moreland points out that shortly after the crucifixion, there's a massive shift in Jewish social structures. We're talking about 10,000 plus Jews suddenly abandoning centuries-old traditions. Traditions they deeply believed were absolutely necessary for their salvation.
And we aren't talking about minor habits here. These were foundational, identity-defining practices.
Moreland lists 5 key exhibits for this. First, the sacrifices. For over 1,000 years, Jews offered animal sacrifices to atone for sin. Suddenly, this huge group just stops. They believe Jesus was the final sacrifice.
That is a huge theological shift. What else?
Second, the law of Moses. They moved away from strict adherence to the ceremonial law as their primary means of standing with God. Third, the Sabbath. This is a massive one. They shifted their day of worship from Saturday, which was a strict God-ordained commandment, to Sunday, simply to celebrate the resurrection.
That sounds dangerous. In that culture, breaking the Sabbath was historically a capital offense.
It was. It's like canceling the weekend and risking a death sentence to do it. Fourth, monotheism. They began worshiping Jesus, a physical man, as God. For a first-century Jew, that is blasphemy of the highest possible order. And fifth, the concept of the Messiah itself. They accepted a suffering, dying Messiah, whereas the cultural expectation was a conquering political hero who would use force to defeat the Romans.
So they flipped their entire worldview upside down almost overnight. But I have to ask the hard question here, just playing devil's advocate. People join cults today. People change their lifestyles for crazy beliefs all the time. Does this social shift really prove the resurrection happened?
That is a very fair challenge. But Moreland makes a vital distinction here. Yes, people die for their beliefs all the time. Religious extremists, for example, might blow themselves up for their faith. But they die for what they believe to be true based on the teachings and testimony of others. They weren't there when the religion started. They simply have faith.
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
The original disciples were in a completely unique position. They were the eyewitnesses. They didn't just have faith, they had knowledge. They knew for an absolute fact whether they had seen Jesus alive or if they were just making the whole thing up.
So if it was a hoax, they were the scammers. They were the ones running the con.
Exactly. And nobody willingly dies for what they know to be false. Liars make incredibly poor martyrs. If it was a hoax, someone would have cracked under pressure. They faced torture, isolation, and gruesome executions. Yet there is no historical record of any of the core group ever recanting. They went to their deaths consistently claiming they had seen him alive. That level of commitment suggests they were absolutely convinced of the truth of what they physically saw.
So let's try to pull all this together for the listener. We've unpacked a lot of incredibly dense material today.
We really have. If we look at it strictly as a cold case, we have quite a stack of evidence. We have the medical certainty that Jesus was dead. The swoon theory is out. We have the empty tomb, which was acknowledged even by the enemies who tried to explain it away. We have the incredibly early dating of the creeds, proving this wasn't just a legend that developed centuries later over a game of telephone.
We have the eyewitness accounts, the women, the disciples, the hostile skeptics like Paul and James. We have the psychological impossibility of mass hallucinations explaining these varied group encounters.
And we have the social earthquake, the radical transformation of thousands of people and the birth of a global movement based on a falsifiable claim right in the very city where the public execution happened.
It is a profoundly compelling case. But before we wrap up today, I really want to touch on something deeply personal from the source material. We've been very analytical today, very brain-focused, but Dr. Gary Habermas shared something quite emotional at the end of his interview.
He did. It's a very poignant moment in the sources. Habermas is known as this tough, intellectual debater, but he shared the story of losing his own wife to stomach cancer. He talked about sitting on his porch just in the absolute depths of grief and realizing that all this historical evidence wasn't just an intellectual game to him anymore.
He said, if Jesus was raised, then there's an answer to death.
That's the emotional anchor of this entire investigation. He realized that if the historical evidence actually holds up, if Jesus actually conquered death, then his wife is going to be okay. It means death isn't the final end of the story. The rigorous intellectual evidence became his emotional lifeline in his darkest moment.
And that leads us perfectly to the final thought from J.P. Moreland. He issues a direct challenge to the listener. He says the evidence is strong enough to convince a jury, but it screams for what he calls an experiential test.
Right. Because history can only take you so far. You can believe Napoleon existed based on facts, but you can't know him personally today. Moreland argues that if the historical evidence points to the conclusion that Jesus conquered death and is alive today, then the logical next step isn't just to agree with the facts intellectually. It is to actually try and interact with him.
To see if he's actually there right now.
Exactly. If the phone creates a ringing sound, logic dictates you pick it up to see who is on the other end. If the historical evidence strongly suggests a living person, the most logical step is to attempt contact. It shifts the burden from a historical debate to your present moment.
A very provocative thought to leave you with. Whether you are a skeptic, a seeker, or a longtime believer, the cold case of the resurrection is clearly one that demands a personal verdict. Thanks for taking this deep dive into history with us.
It was a fascinating journey.
We will see you on the next one.